Hi everyone, Grover Neville here. I know it's hard to believe because I don't have blue hair, but I swear it's really me. Today I'm going to be talking about the ZMF Caldera, this headphone right here. Now the ZMF Caldera is a really interesting return to form for the brand, and when I say return to form, you'll find out what I mean in just a minute, but first let's back up and talk a little bit about what the ZMF Caldera actually is.
Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. If you enjoy our videos, you might also like our other work for audiophiles and music lovers: written equipment reviews, editor's choice ratings, product news, and music reviews. Get the latest each week with a free subscription to our email newsletters. A link is in the description.
The Caldera is a planar magnetic headphone from ZMF, and it uses a new in-house driver, which has been built by ZMF specifically for this headphone. They utilize also some of their existing technology around the baffles they've developed for the other flagship headphones in their line. And of course, it has that famous ZMF wood cup that's CNC machined and has specific porting and sound holes for each model. Now, let's talk a little bit about that planar magnetic driver. So planar magnetic drivers, of course, are a mylar film, which is held in place by a tensioning mechanism and has magnets that cause it to vibrate, unlike a dynamic driver, which uses a more typical spider and magnet setup generally. Now, ZMF has been making headphones with dynamic drivers for quite some time, and their in-house drivers range from sort of standard dynamic cone drivers, which are various plastics, up to more exotic materials, which include biocellulose and even beryllium in headphones like the Verite. Now, ZMF, for those who may not know, has actually been around for a long time. I met Zach Merbach and Bevan, I think, it's over 13 or maybe 16 years ago when I was actually 13. At the time, Zach was working as a luthier and also as a professor of film at Columbia. So it's been a long and very storied history to this company, and they actually got their start doing modifications to Fostex T50RP planar magnetic headphones. So the original ZMF headphones sort of started with the modifications of that driver, and this is a very common place for many companies in head-fi to have started. So Dan Clark Audio is another one that started with Fostex T50 mods, and there are several others. Now, from there, ZMF has come a long way, like I said, to making their own dynamic drivers. And so the Caldera, being a planar magnetic driver, which is actually made in-house and is not a Fostex modified driver, is kind of a cool return or homage to the foundations of the company. Is it effective, though? How does the Caldera sound? Well, my experience with ZMF headphones in general is that the wood type and the cable type, and of course the pads and all of these other things, will sort of go into forming the final tonality. But in general, one can say that ZMF headphones have a slightly romantic or rich sound to them. There's a little dip somewhere in the 500 to 600 hertz range on a lot of the headphones, and they tend to have generally a slight downward tilting tonality. So the treble is tapered off gently a little bit, and the low end tends to have a little bit of a boost. This reminds me roughly of something like the B&K curve for speakers, where there's a slight tilt of maybe 3 dB from plus 3 dB at 20 hertz down to negative 3 dB at about 20K. And I know I'm butchering those numbers, but just bear with me for a moment. So let's talk a little bit about the Caldera's specific take on the ZMF tonality. Well, first of all, of course, this is not a dynamic driver. So you have a lower impedance. Instead of that 300 ohms, you're looking at a much lower 50 or 60 ohm impedance. So instead of that higher impedance dynamic driver, you're going to have a lower impedance planar magnetic driver. Now, planar magnetic drivers tend to have a little bit more coherent sound to them. They tend to have a very linear sound, and they tend to have a lot of linearity and punch in the low end. This is definitely true of the Caldera. There's a really punchy, quick sound to it. It has a fast, sort of speedy attack, both in the mid-range and in the low registers. That's really appealing and is kind of more typical of a planar magnetic sound. The treble response, though, is quite smooth, and I will say, I think it's a little smoother than the dynamic drivers, although perhaps has more of that sort of flatter planar magnetic tonality. I tend to like planar magnetic headphones. I've been a fan of Audeze and Dan Clark and ZMF for a long time, so folks know, of course, that I like planar magnetic headphones. If you prefer that sort of more organic tonality, though, of a dynamic driver, I don't think you're going to be disappointed by something like the Caldera. It still has that slight richness of a ZMF headphone, and it still has that slight downward tilt, but in this case, it's in a pretty linear package. I would say this is probably the most linear ZMF headphone I've heard to date. Treble sounds great, no major peaks, and there's just a great sense of, like I said, cohesion and sort of unity between all the different registers, the top, middle, and bottom. It does have that little characteristic 500 to 600 hertz dip. It gives voices a slight distance, so rather than being really up front, something like a modern pop vocal might sit just a little back. And this kind of goes into the next strength of the headphone, which is a really great sense of 3D spatial imaging and positioning. So rather than those left, center, right blobs that you tend to get with a lot of headphones, you get a little bit more fill-in in the in-between spaces with the Caldera. Now, I think that part of this is also the new ZMF technology that has gone into some of their previous headphones, and they have their own custom baffles, and they CNC machine in specific parts in the wood cups to kind of direct and waveguide the sound. These improvements mean that unlike an older ZMF headphone where you, if you had opened up the cup, might have found evidence of something being a little bit more of a modification, pieces of damping material, etc. Here, pieces are more or less machined or 3D printed, and the thing is built essentially as, a finished industrial product. I think that this sort of difference in build quality also represents something about ZMF that I find very interesting, which is that they're a company that marries art and science. They have always been really into making wood-cupped headphones, and of course, they've always had a little bit richer, more romantic tonality, something that some people may refer to as a music listener's tuning. Now, that said, Zach is also an avid user of measurements, and he really appreciates the science. Like I said, that special baffle, creating their own drivers, and of course, all the things that go into making the cups of the headphones work and all that sort of stuff. So they're very much a measurements and technical results focused company, and they have now married these two together. I think given the complexity of a planar magnetic driver and how hard it is to get them right, tensioning consistently, tuning consistently, that sort of thing, it's actually pretty impressive. To me, going back to this planar magnetic driver is kind of paying homage to the roots of the company, and the Caldera represents kind of the pinnacle of ZMF's lineage of marrying that art and that science. Now let's talk a little bit about the price point. For $3,500, is this headphone competitive? Well, I think that most of the competitors for the Caldera are going to be something in the range of $400 to $4,500. We're talking about Dan Clark Audio Expanses. We're talking about LCD-5s. We're not talking so much about Hi-Fi Man Sosfaras or Abyss 1266. Those headphones have a higher level of resolution, and they play in a slightly different category because they demand special amplifiers of a much higher price. With a Caldera, I could use amplifiers like the Ferrum OOR, which was my favorite pairing. It's my studio amplifier that I use when mixing, mastering, and producing. And it sounded fantastic. The linearity but slight warmth of the Ferrum really complemented, again, that slight linearity and warmth of the Caldera to make for something that I could just listen to without having to worry about whether the treble sounded a particular way or the bass sounded a particular way. Things just gelled, and the bandwidth and headroom was fantastic. Now, I also did try my Black Pearl from Ampsandsound amplifier with 300Bs, and that sounded fantastic as well. It was a little more romantic sound, a little bit more spatial, there was a little bit more richness and depth, and I really enjoyed it, but I have to say I would not be disappointed if I had to use the Ferrum OOR as my main headphone amplifier for these headphones all the time. Now, those looking to use something like an OTL, I would say you can do this, but it wouldn't be my first choice just because planar magnetic headphones have that lower impedance and generally like a little bit more power than those OTL amplifiers can provide. Now let's talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, those competitors, something like a DCA Expanse or something like an Audeze LCD-4. Those headphones are both leaner in tonality in general than the ZMF. Perhaps the DCA Expanse is a little bit more linear and neutral, but it is much more heavily damped, and it has a more heavily damped sound. And likewise, the LCD-4 from Audeze, while it has excellent dynamics, is going to be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more forward-sounding headphone. The ZMF, by contrast, is going to have that more relaxed, slightly more spatial sound, and it's going to be just a little more romantic. I think for the listener who's looking for listening pleasure at $3,500 compared to the $500 or $1,000 price increases of those two headphones at retail, it's pretty fair to say that this represents a decent bargain in the high-end planar magnetic flagship realm. Now, I'm not going to say any of these headphones are cheap, of course. However, I think for those who may own multiple headphones, the price of a Caldera is relatively reasonable for what amounts to a very high-end planar magnetic flagship. Again, this is not necessarily in the realm of a Susvara or a 1266 or some of the other more exotic options, like a Monolith. However, I do think that in this case, for the $3,500 price point, you're getting a headphone which competes with a very top 10 to 15% of headphones out there, and also, interestingly enough, rewards you a lot more for picking great amplifiers. With the Caldera, I felt I was hearing more out of the amplifiers that I have and more differences between the amplifiers than with some of the other headphones in my stable. And I do have a DCA Expanse and an LCD-4 on hand. That said, both of those headphones also did show off differences between amplifiers well, but they certainly had clear preferences. Some amplifiers worked better with them than others. The Caldera, despite being a slightly more colored headphone, actually felt like it was telling me more about what the amplifier was doing as part of the contribution to the sound, and still felt like it had a sort of friendly approach even to poorly mixed music. So I think the Caldera is a really interesting tool for those who really are interested in hearing what their amplifier is doing, playing around with different amplifiers, and again, having fun doing all of it. There was never a bad combination I encountered, even when plugging into a relatively inexpensive amplifier. So at $3,500, I think the Caldera represents actually quite a fair value. Now, of course, if you order extra different sets of pads, exclusive woods, a fancier case, an upgraded cable, then that price will start to rise and start to be about equivalent with something like an Expanse or an LCD-4. That said, I think that ZMF asks relatively reasonable prices for what are essentially hand-assembled products and should last a lifetime. The wooden cups are extremely sturdy, and these products in general are kind of heirloom feeling. They're things that you feel like you could pass on. There are early ZMF headphones that I've seen and owned that have lasted for many, many years, decades now, even at this point, with no major issues at all. And I have to say that there's something to be said about buying an audio product that you could own for a long time. And in that vein, the ZMF Caldera, by going back to the beginnings and origins of ZMF as a planar magnetic headphone company, really feels like it's embracing the heritage of the company, both sonically and, of course, in practice. The build quality is amongst the very best and most robust that I've ever seen. So if you're in the market for a planar magnetic headphone and you're interested in a more sort of warm to linear tuning, and you really want to hear what your different amplifiers are doing, or you want to swap between or own multiple different pairs of amplifiers, I would say the ZMF Caldera is an excellent choice. You should definitely check it out.